So in the previous share, we jumped into a pretty huge subject, which is the question of maros nowadays. That's pretty major. And by which we mean, more specifically, paskening with regards to colors, to shades, tamei tahor. So we began with the question of the Messiah, as it's very common to describe it. And we saw there were two of the great poskim 150 years ago who were asked about a chacham who he paskin tamei, someone else came and paskin tahor, which is its own halachic topic. And we saw that the Beis Shleima, he said it's a hira, it's a psak, but it's only al pisvara, which has an afkamina in the sugya of chacham shahira. And the way he says it is you can't say there's any tradition, there's anything you learn from your Rabbi in maros. All we have is what the Shulchan Aruch says, to stay away from anything that's red, only white and green, white and yellow. So, so if there's any hint of red or black, would be tamei. So therefore, no one has any tradition from his Rabbi. So therefore, can't say when it comes to chacham shahira that I paskin according to my tradition. No, you paskin according to your svara. So that means in this case that the first chacham can't be overruled by the second chacham. We saw that Dovid Chaim was asked the same question. He went even further, went more extreme. He said, we stay far away from red. So therefore, it's not even a psak. Women can look at it themselves. There's no psak at all. And if you have a question, doesn't mean you have to go to the Rav. If you have a question, this topic, so get a group of people, get the Reiv B'nai Adam, and figure out together what it looks like to you. Is there red or is there no red? So according to the Dovid Chaim, the whole sentence, paskening maros, is incorrect. There's no such concept. Fine, that's pretty extreme. We already mentioned on this, just specifically on this question, is it nimser l'chachamim or is it nimser l'nashim? We find different achronim say different things, but almost everyone would agree that there are some things that a woman can decide on herself, on her own, whether l'chumra or l'kula. And then there are things where if there's any doubt, then she shouldn't decide on her own. She should bring it to her Rav. And be warned that if you are deciding, don't decide l'chumra where it's not warranted. Don't decide l'kula if it's not warranted. But at the end of the day, a woman doesn't bring literally every single bedika that passes through her hands to the Rav. So we obviously, if it's completely clean and white. So obviously, everyone agrees there's some things that have no doubt. So then it's possible that even as time goes on, even slightly stronger shades, if it becomes 100% clear that there's no doubt that it's tamei or tahor, then that can be incorporated as well. So there is some room. It's not 100% the Rav's domain according to anyone. I saw in the Kovetz Hamadrich Lahira from New Square from last year, they bring some shimush and maros from Moshe Neishlos, who was the previous Rav of New Square, and apparently the main teacher, one of the main of the current Rav of New Square, Rabbi Eisenberger. So they bring there that they once brought a shaila, and his wife, the Rebbetzin, started taking an interest herself, and she said her opinion. So Rav Neishlas told, I think his son, that by his Rabbi, the Rav Yonason Steif of Wien, you saw the same thing, that before the Rebbetzin, she was the one who was guarding the door. Before you got in, she took an interest herself to see if there's b'chal a shayla here. She's the gatekeeper. And if it was a davar pashat, she didn't even, she would say, it's not even a shayla, you can go home. And she paskened, quote unquote, herself. So back to what we were discussing. So we said that l'chayra ha b'ha talia. If we assume that even 150 years ago, when these shaylas were asked, they were still being machmer in the color brown, and they were only matahir mamish, only white and yellow, like the Shulchan Aruch says, which is in fact the Lashon the Shulchan Aruch that's quoted in the Beis Shleima right here. So the shilas relating to colors were probably much fewer, and the few that there were probably often very simple. And even here, where there was some kind of disagreement, right? One Rav said one thing, another Rav said something else. So the Divrei Chaim then goes on and explains that Avada must have originally had some kind of reddish hue, and then it must have sort of gone away, gotten whiter, and that would explain why one Rav said this, one Rav said that. Otherwise, Kenish Zayin, the two Rabbanim would have two different opinions. So the color itself must have changed. And then in that case, of course, you have to follow the first Rav anyway, even if it's not paskening, but surely when he saw it, he saw that it was red. So besides there's taka no room, there's no basis for a Messiah. What do you need a Messiah for? And of course, that's besides the fact that all the sources that we do, from all the sources that we do have, there is in fact no zecher, no reference whatsoever to any kind of ancient Messiah. And it just doesn't seem like there were that many questions, monthly questions back then regarding colors. Mashenkein, when it comes to Tzliya, life was a lot messier back then, so it seems like they had many more questions about stains coming from all kinds of strange possible origins. In the last 100 years or so, as being matter and brown has become more widespread, so then that's where you start having different Messiahs from different Meidei Hira who each in turn trained many Talmidim, because now all of a sudden these halachas have gotten complicated again. And that doesn't mean there's one Messiah. There's multiple Messiahs, quote unquote, meaning multiple Meidei Hira in the last 100 years came up with a gang, a mahalach of how to distinguish between the browns and the reds. And there are those who would make the argument that besides the shak of Ataya and halacha about brown, the etzem mitzias that all of a sudden we have mesaidus, which implies disagreements, suggests that something's wrong. That's what some would argue. That if this is how it turned out, then aren't we doing? Hasn't something gone wrong? Okay. We started already looking into the basic mekaidus of Siman Kuf Peches. There are 5 colors, 5 shades, depending on how you explain it, of red in the Mishnah. Then there are the ones in the Mishnah, the colors of the shades in the Mishnah that are tahor, which clearly seems to mean that originally had nothing to do with redness, because some of the maros tahor were red, but it's just a certain Messiah that they had. And already in the Gemara, you see a Meran that said that they already felt they didn't have a handle on it. And then you get to the time of Rishonim, when it was ungenommen by everyone, like we see in the Rosh, B'deidas halolo ein baki lidus b'damim lishoin al chachmasei, to distinguish between dam ledam. Va'afilu b'mei chachmei hatalmud hoyu min hachacham shoyinim noim lidus dam kol shekeino idna she'ein l'tar shum dam adoyme l'maris admumis emloi she'yehilovan v'yare kamara hazav. And the way the Beis Yosef is magded it, the kivin sheim noitim l'mare admumis, even the ones in the Mishnah that the Mishnah says are fine. Ve'einonu b'kim b'maris mitaminin lahu. V'lo meta'arinon ela lovin v'yorek, by which we mean yellow mishum deles lahu nitiyah la'admumis klau. So the literal Evan Abaychen, the standard, the test is there nitiyah la'admumis or there's no nitiyah la'admumis? That's, since the Rishonim, how these halachas work. And we touched on the fact that on some level you have to take cultural considerations and differences in cultures into account when you discuss colors. And this is recognizable from within what Chazal themselves say, but we can also witness this out there in the world. So for example, the word yarek in Chazal was a word that encompassed what we would call yellow, green, and blue. And it's not just a technical thing, what do you call it? It means that if someone, just like you go to the shelf and you see 2 shades of blue, someone asks you, are those the same color? You would say, yeah, they're both blue. Can I tell the difference between shades of blue? Of course I can. But those are both one color. So in the time of Chazal, that meant that if you showed someone a yellow object and a green object and a blue object, and you asked them, are these the same color? They would say, yeah, they're the same, they're all yarek. That's yarek karsi, that's yarek kazav, that's yarek, but that means literally that the word encompassed multiple colors that in our minds is already hard to see as one. Only when you get to Tosfos, who spoke European languages, which are close to how we speak, so then you start seeing a more familiar way of discussing these sugyas. So for example, in Sukkah, they take all the Bekaitis about Yarek, and they say, okay, these are Tzeva Shekoirin Vird Belaz, that's green. And these are Tzeva Shekoirin Irinda Belaz, that's blue. And these are Tzeva Yala Belaz, yellow. Oh, so now Tosfos is speaking in familiar terms. This is green, this is blue, this is yellow. But in Chazal, it's all one big mixture. They don't see any need to clarify. And they'll even say, you'll see in Chazal, they'll say, this is the same color as that, and one is green and one is blue. So it also seems like there's a fairly strong yesod to say that this may have been the case originally with regard to red, that once upon a time brown was not considered its own color, but a sort of variety or shade of red. And in other words, if you ask someone, these two things, are they the same color? They would say yes. Doesn't mean they couldn't tell the difference. But the language and the culture meant that it was classified in one's mind as two varieties of the same color. And I saw someone who wanted to make the assertion that essentially, if you look in Chazal use, and Rishonim who are speaking in Hebrew, use a four-color language. There's black, there's white, there's Yarek, which is yellow-green, and Adam, red. All the other terms you'll see for colors in Chazal are referring to objects. Zahav is gold, Chelis is a dye, Argaman is a dye, Talash Shani is a worm. Those are all specific objects and dyes used in life, and they were able to reference them in conversation. Just like the Mishnah references all kinds of things for different colors of red. But those are the only four proper colors as colors. And in fact, we're going to get into that as a specific discussion in a separate installment. I'm just giving some holistic ideas to keep in mind. So I found an article about languages even today. There are people who have studied thousands of languages. Obviously, many of them are obscure at this point across the universe. They say when a language has three terms for colors, if you're a three-color language, the first are black and white. The third one is almost always centered on use that English speakers would call red. So if you have a three-color language, it's always black, white, and red. There are no languages with three-color terms where it would be black, white, and green. That doesn't happen. If a language has four-color terms, they will be black, white, red, and either yellow or green, which would be familiar from what we see in Chazal. In the next stage, both yellow and green are present. So there's a distinction that gets separated. While the next color terms to be added are blue and brown in that order. English, by contrast, has 11 basic colors. That's where we're holding at this point. We have black, white, red, green, yellow, blue, pink, gray, brown, orange, and purple. So you just have to be able to understand where other people are coming from with their language and how they perceive colors. They mention that brown is the last of those basic colors on the list. And we can actually kind of trace the history of the color brown in language being recognized formally and consistently as a color. If you're speaking English, in English the word is brown, and in Yiddish and German the word is bruin, essentially all the same word. So that word seems to have developed in the last 1,000 years or so, and I've seen them say that in English at least, the first source where we see brown appear to be used in the modern sense of a proper color is around the year 1300. So it's a fairly relatively recent development. Certainly it's already deep into Rishonim. And in fact, it's interesting that English and German actually have mamish, its own words for brown, because in many other languages it seems that they actually use the names of objects till today as the source for the term for brown. So for example, I saw online someone was asking, what's the correct way to say brown in Spanish? Is it, I didn't look up the pronunciation, but is it like café, call it coffee colored, or is it marron? Marron, originally from French, refers to chestnuts. Coffee and chestnuts, by the way, are the two things that every single tshuva on the topic of the Mar Broin, they always say, like armoinim and coffee. Those are the two things that are associated with the color. So that was the question, which word in Spanish? Like coffee or like chestnuts? And by the way, in English we have the word maroon, and the word maroon in English comes from the same term, chestnuts, but yet in English maroon is a brownish crimson, which is fairly red, if you look it up. Which itself goes to show you that even chestnuts, the definition of chestnuts, the definition of brown, very close to red. Anyway, my point is that there seems to be a very close connection between language and how we grasp and group colors, and that, just to keep in mind, can have an impact on these halachic discussions. So, Lamaisa, the serious discussion about the color brain and maros started in the 1700s, started gathering speed in the 1800s, and really only became recognizable as we know it today in the 1900s, as recently as that. So in this shiur, I would like to go through just an overview of the main makairis in achreinim themselves, so we could have a sort of a taidic anchor in the sugya, not just saying, broad statements. We can go through some of the svarim, and that will then enable us to then advance to the discussions that are taking place today. And before I get to these makairis though, a disclaimer: there's a certain difficulty when you deal with a subject like this, because ultimately there are many browns. So when things are being written in writing, especially when they're not being particularly vivid and clear, so it's never really possible to know if everyone's even talking about the same things. Everyone's saying words. What do those words represent? It's hard to know for sure. Maybe someone who's machmer and brown is talking about something very specific. Although, as we said, all the tshuvas are all mentioning the color of coffee, for example. Color of coffee is a pretty not reddish brown. There's no variation of coffee that I've seen that has any reddishness as we would identify it. It's also possible, nowadays especially, people point out that sometimes poskim, that paskin amaris today, when they write their sefer, they're a little bit more machmer, and then you hear, Bal Peh, they're a lot more mekel. So it could be, there is some kind of gap like that in the past as well that we don't know about. But that could always be true, and we can only work with the sources that we have. And we can try to, with whatever caveats and disclaimers, we're going to try to work with what we have. It's also one more disclaimer to make. It's also hard to know whether there is any difference in the rate of brown maros. Could it be that maybe once there were fewer and now there are many more? We can't know for sure. Times, places, diets, lifestyles. But I would think that it's probably most common right after the 5 days. When a woman's trying to become tar is probably when it's most common, essentially when her body is still concluding the Dmei Nida. So it would make sense to assume it's very possible that back in the day, they just viewed it as one hemshech, as one continuation. Oh, she's not clean yet. She's started off redder, got a little darker, but she's not clean yet. And okay, so we'll delay the tahor by a day or two. What's the problem? Especially since our understanding of ovulation is, I assume, fairly recent. And the idea that, there's a window for ovulation, and if you delay the tahor for a certain percentage of women by 1 or 2 days till they're fully white and clean, then that might mean that they'll never have a chance of becoming pregnant. Who knows how many people 100 years ago could have all just been, they didn't have children. It could have just been something as simple as that, unfortunately. We don't know. But since they were not aware of that, so it would just make sense that, if I had to guess, that people might have just viewed it that way. So, I said that the discussion starts in the 1700s, but many have pointed out that in the last few decades, there's actually a much older makar that was printed. There's a shut, Yefei Noif, by Rabbi Yitzchak Mazia. He lived in the time of the Ramah. And you find this, I mentioned this in the past with the Shoik, with the Mekar Chaim, that sometimes you find that Dafka, a sefer that's been in Ksav Yad for 500 years, turns out that he he spoke about a subject, he spoke about a question 200 years ahead of everybody else. We only find that out la'achar ha'maisa. So that's an example. This is an example of that as well. In Shut Yefei Noif Siman Tzadok Vav, he writes, "V'leka l'sapuki b'mara broin imhu min hamaras hatmeis ilav." He seems to be the first to mention it. I don't know if he's the first sefer to mention the color b'chlal, but certainly the first that anyone knows of in this context. And he uses the German word broin. So there's no suffix whether it's from the maras hatmeis or not, because all the Paiskim said, "Ein tahor ela b'mara lavan v'yarik," and the Mordechai says clearly, green and gel. We're using words that we know, green and gel and bloy. That's all yarik. That's it. We're only matayr, lavan and yarik. That includes green, yellow, and blue. Brown isn't green, yellow, or blue. Hi mara broin pshita the noita yeser ladmumis mikol hanimaris veina b'chlal yarik. The only category you could shoehorn it into is yarik, and it's clearly not. If anything, it's more like admumis. And this noita ladmumis, of course, is what we say is a problem. So even Makaitis from Sadesha, and that even has a problem with libun and yarik. Okay, that we don't go with. That we're not chayshish to. But kalmakim kamara broin lekam man de mesabik bei. That's what the Yefei Noif said in the 1500s. So he's the only one who had anything to say about it. And he says, obviously everyone knows for a fact that it's Neitel Admumah, certainly not Yarik. So of course it's included in the Maras Asudim, not in the Maras Mutarim. This makar was not published at the time, it wasn't known, and therefore it didn't have any direct impact on these halachic discussions. But since he's the only person to speak up for this entire period, so one would tend to assume that he's representative of that entire period. No one else had anything to the contrary to say. So now we get to the makar that really started the discussion, from which there's a continuous discussion, that is Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden's Sefer She'elas Yavitz was printed, he printed it in the year 1738. So he says, Mara dam hanoitel etzeva broin, it's like the shells of chestnuts, uchamashka akave, like coffee. So he says, so the way he looks at it, coming from his perspective, it's like there's been no discussion about it. There's no clue one way or the other. It's like it's been completely ignored this entire time. So he says, Nidali, I think we should be makel, because Basar Tzali, the Mishnah says, is really tahor. Even though we're machmir, but this is definitely a lot less red than Basar Tzali. So if Basar Tzali, which is a shade of pink essentially, in his opinion, it's really tar, and we know what that shade looks like, but we're machmir anyway. We're bucky and we're still machmir. We don't want to get confused. Not like we're not bucky. We're bucky. We just don't want to get it confused because it has an atiyah, la'edem, and the rule is if whenever there's an atiyah, we're machmir. That's pink. Mash'enk mamara broin hanisker she'ein lein atiyah la'admumis el l'shachros. So he makes a claim. He says it's not red b'chlal. I don't see any red. Look at coffee, taka. If anything, it reminds me of black. So his big idea is that it's simply not red. Now, according to how we look at colors today, that would depend on which shade of brown, like coffee, like he mentioned. But chestnuts, on the other hand, not so simple, because there are some chestnuts that they'll do lean more towards red. There are also browns that lean towards yellow, as he himself will seem to mention soon. The modern definition of brown, now we have, people grow up today, you hear colors, this color is a mixture of those colors, that color is a mixture of those colors. That seems to be a pretty modern understanding of how colors work, but we'll just mention it for the sake of mentioning it. If you look up brown, shades of brown can be produced by combining red, yellow, and black. So essentially, brown by definition has an atiyah to red, and to black, and to yellow. So if you emphasize the yellow part, then that'll be the least of your problems. Yaakov Emden is trying to argue that it's black and not red, and he's going to try to argue that because it's like black and not red, that makes it easier, that makes it better. What is saying that it's more black than red help us? Aren't red and black both tameh? So he says, no, it says in the Mishnah that deho of shachar is tahor. And there's no sveikas. By red, it says they got confused. It doesn't say they got confused about black. Now, it's not clear what he's trying to say. Is he really trying to say that al pi halacha, al pi shulchan aruch, a light shade of black is mutter, and therefore brown is a light shade of black and is mutter? That's a big discussion of the achreinim that come after him, because seemingly that's not the halacha. But that's what he seems to be saying. And then he adds, kol shekain biyorek broin. So is he talking about the same thing now, or is he talking about a more yellowish brown? He says, that's not even black. It's not even faded black. If you take this brown and you have a very deep version of it, it reminds you a little bit of a very faint black. So it's still, there's a lack of clarity in what he's saying. Is he talking about two shades of brown? He's saying one brown is like deya de shachar, and that's fine as well. And then one is not shachar, by loya filu deya de dead, or is he explaining the same brown he was talking about this whole time, the coffee? But at least at this point, he's making the point that at least one shade of brown that's b'chalal not, it's almost like it's its own thing. And he adds kavachomer from green, from yellow. According to Chazal, yellow and red also have a connection. And yet, no one says there's a problem with yellow. So kol shekain yorek broin shu rachik moed min adam, even more than some yellows. Hard to understand why yorek broin. Okay, that's what he says. So he ends off by saying pshita by a kasem. That means until now he's been talking about bedikas. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden essentially, you could say, made history here and gave us this yesod. He went out and made a statement that it's fine. Of course, you can always ask and debate what color, what shade is he talking about. One Lubavitcher Makar that deals with this more be'iyun lately is Machane Michal by Rav Michal Shlema Avishid from Beit Shemesh. And Tafshanai and Zion, he printed a tadpis of his Shiur Manida on 4 topics. I don't know if he even printed it. There's a PDF that I found. And one of them is on this sugya of Broin. And what's one of the Makairos I was looking at when I was going through this topic for the Shiur. However, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was not actually really located and situated in the best spot, the best time and place to have a direct halachic impact. It's not like he had Talmidim that were Moedei Hira. He was a bit in his own category. It also doesn't seem like his sefer was necessarily so widely influential, at least immediately. So the next important makar, which is probably more important for spreading this idea, is the Sidrei Tara. The Sidrei Tara is by Rav Charan Ashkenazi, originally from Germany. And of course, Sidrei Tara is a very, very essential chashuv sefer in these halachas, very influential. It's not fully clear from the Sharblat when it was printed. From looking at the Sharblat, it looks like the year should be 1773, which would be like a year after the Maggid passed away, when the Alter Rebbe just barely started out. However, most places say it's from 1783, probably because the Sharblat implies that he passed away, and we seem to know that he passed away in Tafkuf Mem, so one of the Yuds on the Sharblat has to also be part of the Gematria of the year, so 1783. Sidrei Tara, Siman Kuf Peiches, Sefkat Aleph says, Kol Mara Adam, says in the Gemara, it says this whole thing about Ein Boitkin, Ela Ben Chamal, Etzel, you have to have, when you're checking the colors, you have to have the right lighting. He says the Paiskim, they skip all this. Why? Because we're not doing maros. Chazal were doing maros. They needed lighting. We're not doing that. Ananim bekim maros damim. V'loy metaharinon. Elo mara yorek v'lovan. So mishum hachi shayar linis b'chol makom v'chol zman. That's how he starts off. Okay? That stems with the general point that it seems like no special mumchias was necessary to paskin maros. Then he adds, matzasi kasuv, and he notably doesn't say where. Dam hanoitel et seva broin b'lashon Ashkenaz, which is like klipas armoin v'chamashka kave, is tahor. Ve'ein tzorach leimer b'kasem. The v'she'ein noitel admimos kim l'shachar. He's mekatzer. He brings it very bekitzer. Ukvar shaninu deya mikein tahor. It says in the Mishnah that shachar, faint shachar, is tahor. So he brings all that teichen of the Yaakov Emden very bekitzer, that same mysterious idea from the Mishnah that everyone gets bothered by. Many point out that he didn't even mention the makar. He just said matzasi kasov. And some of those who even looked in the Sidrei Tahara didn't know what his makar was. But as time went on, people realized, oh, okay, the Shelas Yavitz, that's the makar. He mentions it again, actually in Siman Kuf Tzadik here, where we're learning, by the Zayin Samanim, in Sivkot Nun Beis. He brings that there really is a shitta from the Tvua Shur, by Trefus, where there also are shilas of colors, that the Tvua Shur Taka has a yisoid to think that by faint shachar we should be more makel. By reds, we're machmer, kol anoyta lad mumis. But maybe when it comes to black, lav dafka, there is at least an argument to be made. The Sidrei Tahara dafka is doicha, the Tvua Shur says, no, it can't be. We don't, we treat all the halachas of nida equally. We don't say we're being makel in shachar. Then he says though, mikamakam nida bekesam, in the context of Siman Kuf Tzadik is ksamim, mikamakam nida bekesam hanoyta l'shachar ve'eni shachar mamish, the yesh lahakal. Kivan daleka isra deiraisa elam midrabanan. Because the whole isra of ksamim is midrabanan. But dafka b'riya gemura, ayadei b'dikas, he's still talking about noyta l'shachar. He didn't, so, v'dafka b'riya gemura, ayadei b'dikas eil habadakla, shehiri, k'riya gemura achmiru v'lei bekesam. So surely we're machmir in all shades of black. But when we say that, it's by b'dikas. By kasam could be the tzirif of shachar, and ksamim could be remekel. Umikol shekein hamara shenoyta l'tzava brayin afilu harbe. Kvar kasaf d'leil b'shem etzasi kasov, which also confused some of the achrenim that came later, because it sounds like from this context that he's only, even with brayin, he's only talking about ksamim maybe, and not b'dikas, because he just came from saying that by noyta l'shachar, we're only makel by ksamim and not by b'dikas, and then kol shekein brayin. Not so clear. People point out that in the last few decades, they printed a work by Rabbi Ronsberg of Prague, B'Shem Pischei Nida, that he wrote. He wrote it in the year 1806, a bit later. And he writes, I'm going to mention what I saw in the Sidrei Tahara. And he says, Da she'achri shanam nalbes shekasavti zeh, shamati ma'ararim al kula da hagoyin Sidrei Tahara. He calls it the kula of the Sidrei Tahara, and I heard people being ma'arer, because he wrote Batsasi Kasov, and he didn't say where. They found that suspicious. People were being ma'arer on that. Matzasi davar zeh, that it's Yaakov Emden. Why are you? It's not typical for the Sidrei Tahara. It's not in character. Why did he just write Matzasi Kasov? So he says, interesting historical theory. He says, Ulai tina haisa b'libayalav. Maybe he was upset at the Yaakov Emden. Why? The Rashka Baha, Baal Teferes Yisrael, Kresi Uplesi, Yurim Betumim, Yaris Dvash. We know, everyone knows, famously there was a Machlaikas, so it could be the Sidrei Tahara had that in the back of his mind, and he liked what the Yaakov Emden was saying, but he didn't want to dignify him with a clear shout out. So then he ended up confusing people later on, but Yagaitu Matzasi, it's Yaakov Emden and Ebazoi, it has a makar, and the Sidrei Tahara brings it. Ebazoi, we could rely on it. So he mentions Ma'ararim, but he's at least joining and embracing it. A continuation to that discussion, we see in the Shas Tshuva Simlas Ben Yamin, Rav Wolf Hamburg. He was a Rav in Germany in the 1800s, which means already after things had started changing in Germany, the Rabbanim were already a bit of the new style. So Shut Simlas Ben Yamin was printed in 1840. So there's a shaila, he was asked by a Talmud of Hirsch ben Leksh of Frankfurt. He writes, the Talmud writes, I have a question. There's a woman who I know, she has a lot of maros during her 7 days. Aber yoyser shchiach liras mara broin. Ad shekamat im netama oysa mara lo yachal atar labayla. She's seeing brown all the time. If we were netama that, she'll never be tar. Now this is Sidrei Tahara, who brings the Matzasi Kosov, and he was already aware, maybe you have the Ksav Yad, that Rabbi Ronsberg Taka found it in the Tshuvas Yavitz, although I don't have a copy of that Sefer. Although, it's not clear from the Sidrei Tahara whether you can rely on it by Bedikas or not, right? Because we saw from the Sidrei Tahara and Siman Kuf Tzadik, it sounded more like Samim only. That's how some people understood it. So the Sidrei Tahara brings it, but maybe the Sidrei Tahara doesn't want to rely on it for Bedikas. And I heard that you are of the Simlas Ben Yamin, you also do not rely on it. So please clarify the situation. And I can't think of how you could slug up the Siddur Tara. It's a Mishnah, no? Isn't it a Mishnah that faint black is tahor? And I'm sending you 2 actual maros, more like maybe a little more rare. You actually see like a shtickle modern type question. I'm sending you 2 maros. So they're from the 5th, day 5 and day 6 from the Zion Akiyim. Not that the rest work better, but I'm sending you those 2. They all ruba de ruba mara broin. And please get back to me. So here are the maros, here's the question. So the Simlas Binyamin responds, doesn't have a date, but it's before 1840. He says, I got your letter, and now I'm looking into your shaila. So he says, even though I didn't find anybody who disagrees with the Siddur Tara, and in fact, the Tshuva Me'ava, Talmud of the Rabbi Yehuda, also just quotes, just a quote, B'Shem the Shelos Yavitz, without offering any disagreement. He says, my colleague, Mendel Kargoy, told me that people are saying how great the Siddur Tara is, it's an unbelievable sefer, and he told me that there's that one kula where he's matir, the Mara Broin, Pikbeku Alav Haloimdim in Frankfurt. That there was, you heard Baal Peh, that when the sefer came out with his heter, the Lomdim in Frankfurt said, we're not so sure. But I didn't hear any... it's like a Chassidus Shemaisa. I didn't hear it with any Svaris, any Mar Makaimis. In Frankfurt, they didn't like it. But if you ask me, the whole vart, the whole yidih is Nismatu Alavavis, called Dover Shenei Lamada Odom Tameh. So Hachanami, I agree that it's Shachar, but if it's Neit Lamada Shachar, it's also Tameh. We treat Adam and Shachar the same. There's no, if you're saying Neit to red is always Tameh, Neit to the black is also Tameh. Who's going to be mad to that? We're not able to make any distinction. And then he mentions Taka, there is Taka, the sheet of the Tvuas Shar, that black should be treated differently than red. But he says the Siddur Tara himself brought the Tvuas Shar, disagreed with him, and then goes on to say about the Broin. So he just saw it as confusing. Does the Siddur Tara hold that certain shades of black are, that certain shades of black are tahor, or not? He's disagreeing with the Tvuas Shar on shades of black, and then he's coming back around with the brown. So he says, if you want to say it's ksamim only, that I could accept. But Eda Badak, we treat it like a deraisa. He says, and it's happened different times where I've seen a certain, it looks like a shmutz, but it's thick, and I was matame. Kol shekain zayin akiyim. I'm assuming he means by maybe even by ksamim. Kol shekain zayin akiyim. So on the one hand, all these makairis that I just mentioned, they're all from Germany, Bohemia, Moravia, that corner of Europe. So on the one hand, he says, I haven't heard of anyone disagreeing with the Siddur Tara. It's not clear if he means halacha l'maisa, he saw people being matir, or he just hasn't seen anybody b'ksav respond to the Siddur Tara. But he heard Baal Peh, he heard people say that in Frankfurt they didn't like it. And in the last few years, someone printed from a ksav yad of another Rav from also this circle, who also writes, Shechach me Frankfurt irar olav, in his halachas that he wrote to himself privately. And the person who printed this points out that Tzayir Mendel Kargoy, who was the one who told the Simlas Binyamin about Frankfurt, and Tzai, this Rav who wrote this ksav yad, they both were Talmidim of Rav Nosson Adler, the Rebbe of the Chassam Sofer in his yeshiva in Frankfurt. So it makes sense to say that when we say in Frankfurt, we mean Rav Nosson Adler. And by the way, that Rav, in that ksav yad, which we only have from the last few years, he was made on himself. If it's yellowish, he interestingly says, Roiv are that yellowish brown, it's yellowish enough that I'm matir b'pshitus. And even b'dikas. Okay, that's the interesting makkah that we just got in the last 10 years. As always, it's difficult to know what everyone's describing, but that's interestingly a marker that's actually describing what he did with Poel Mamash. Interestingly, back to the Simlas Binyamin, there's still a twist, because the guy who asked the Shaila about Brain B'chlal. The Simlas Binyamin said, can't be Matar Brain. but he also sent him 2 maros. So the Simlas Ben Yamin said, I also got the maros you sent me, but when I looked at them, I say they're yellow, they're not brown. So your whole story, the whole sugya, all her maros are brown. I don't know, I got the maros, they look yellow to me. Okay, maybe it wore off. Maybe you saw it lach and I got it yavish, and we follow b'shal sheyatzam and haguf. That's its own discussion. But he says in the future, if a taka is noitim lamada shocher, a blackish brown, as he describes it, like chestnuts and coffee, and she can't be matar labaila, so takanas b'nei Yisrael, then she should do a half. Okay, he says try to do a half sektara and not check every day, which is something you hear about today as well. If you don't have a choice to try to just be clean at the beginning and then ignore the middle. If not, get back to me. Again, not clear, does that mean that, at least in those countries, it was taka nispashet l'maisa, because he says no one, I didn't hear anybody disagree, or does it just mean no one wrote anything b'ksav, he's looking for a sefer that talks about it? But he also says he heard that in Frankfurt we're mekabelet. We also saw that Rabbi Tzal himself wrote the Shemati Ma'ararim. He's willing to accept taka that it's more black than red, but he doesn't understand. One of the questions that there is there's the 2 schools of thought. Some say it's pashut red, and then the school of thought that says, fine, Lamer Zagan it's black, but how does that help me? Black and red have the same din. Interestingly, he says that what he got ended up being yellow. So Bazoi, that would l'chayra suggest, assuming that both people weren't crazy, that the brown that was sent him, l'chatchila taka, was a faint yellowish brown. And yet, the implication is that at this point it's too yellow, but if it was slightly more brown, but how much more brown could it have been, then maybe it would have been considered taka brown, that's awesome. So anyway, he says only in some you could be mekel, which of course is not shayach to Reiv Maris that we're talking about. And if you just want to be the pure speculation, I would wonder, all these Makaitis, all these early Makaitis are from Germany or its satellites. I would wonder if even the fact that the word brown is dafka a German word, I would wonder if the existence of that word dafka somehow brought the question there sooner. Someone also points out there's a sefer right before Ma'arei printed in 1831 by Rabbi Aaron Vermes of Metz in France, but he was also originally from Germany. I mentioned him that he was one of the first to discuss microscopic teloim, and that some say he became Kali in the end, and others defend his honor. So someone points out that in his sefer Ma'arei printed in 1831, he writes there's a chibur chadash. He doesn't say the name, but it's clear he means a sidrei Tara. He says, and that's chibur. He's matter to look at maros by night. And what's he talking about? The poskim don't get into it. It was obvious. You can't see anything. Even yellow, you can't see yellow properly at night. And then he throws in, V'gambo eisei chibur metar mara armen v'kafe muchach she'akel b'rehita. He's metar that also. Okay, the whole sefer is not serious. That's the Ma'arei response. But this work was not very influential. No one else seems to quote it. So until now, we've been focusing on a bunch of German Makaitis that are taka more in the tough kufs, right? The Sidrei Tara, we said, is in the late 1700s, and the rest of this discussion is following that. And is definitely a lot more leaning towards being Mekabel the Sidrei Tara. That seems to be the default. Sidrei Tara said what he said. Is there someone who disagrees or not? The question is, what about other countries? Now we actually find another early response in Italy, in the Sefer Miskaras HaShulchan, although it's a totally different country, totally different tradition. But in the Miskaras HaShulchan of Menachem Azariah Meir Castelnovo, he writes, he quotes directly from the Yavitz. The Yavitz is Matar, but we know le Matarin el and v'Yarek, and even pink we're Matama. We're not Baki. So Ebazoi, I'm going to be Machmir to Hanaitim Lamare Admumis. So he's in the school that says it's red and can't be matter. But the Iker question is, what about Eastern Europe? Because we, as Yiddishkeit, we're a hemshech to Eastern Europe. So we find that the discussion there starts a while later. So the earliest we find is the Rosh Ephraim. The Rosh Ephraim on Trefus by the famous guy, Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margolius. He was in Galicia. It's printed, seems, in the 1810s. He writes, I found in Sidrei Tara, and he quotes the Sidrei Tara, and he says, Ich verstehe nicht, Anoichi lo yadati, ma inyan broin l'shacher. What's the connection between brown and black? Klippas are moinim, noitil ha'adam yaisim mishacher. Chestnuts are red, not black. And even if you say it is black, we treat black and red the same. Unless you're just going to say you're talking about ksamim, which are dirabanan, so you want to combine faint black with ksamim, and which maybe is what the Sidrei Tara is actually saying in Simon Kuf Tzaddik, but it doesn't seem that way from what he quotes, B'stam, Matzasi Kosov, the Matzasi Kosov, Yaakov Emden, which he doesn't seem to know, but the Makar, the Matzasi Kosov, seem to mean even Dam Mamish, V'zeh Einoi. A bit after him, we find in 1835 an Atzei Levaina on Hilchas Nida by Rav Nissen of Dubna. He writes, in Nida, he writes, see also what I wrote in Treifus, the Bedam Mamish, Ein Lahakal B'zeh, the Neitel Adam Yesam Mishacher, V'av Shacher Tameh B'Nida. So, Fram Zal Margolius says it's red. The Atzei Levaina says it's red. But the main discussion really started about 50 years after the Reish Ephraim. And one can also speculate, does it have to do with how widespread the Sidrei Tara was? Because the Sidrei Tara originally was printed in Germany. And maybe it wasn't so widespread in Eastern Europe immediately afterwards. Mashenkin in the 1830s, we find they started printing it in Europe and in Lvov. So maybe Pasha the Sidrei Tara became more widespread there, Yeshlachker. Or you could say that in the 1860s is when a bunch of Chachamim all independently wrote Sfarim Anida. So that's, if you don't write a Sefer Anida, you can't discuss Brain. You first have to write a Sefer about it, and then you can discuss it, and that's when a bunch of these Sfarim were all written at the same time. So we find, one after the other, Lechem Simla of Shlomo Gansfried of Hungary. He printed this in 1861 before the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. I actually mentioned the Shiur of Heiteves about his connection with the Divrei Chaim. He got a skama for the Lechem B'Simla, but not for the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. So in 1861, Lechem B'Simla, and the Simla, very bekitzer, he writes, the Sidrei Tara says what he says, Lafini is daiti loy nehira, because we see it's mohu me'odoim v'shacher, it's red and black. M'keim mistaber leimar, da'odim u'el shalak k'tzas. Mistaber is just red, or just like black is a messed up red, so the same for brown. As a bekitzer, brifes it up. So that's in Hungary. Another chibur printed at that time is the Pri Deya, printed also in 1861 by Bezriel Dovid Halevi, a Rav in Kherson, in Ukraine. He was a chassid of Savran. There in the section Sifsei Levi, Sifkat Nalef, he writes, the Sidrei Tara said what he said. First of all, what's up with saying that Deya de Shacher is fine? How does that help you? Gets into that whole sugya. Then he gets into the Sidrei Tara and Simon Kuf Tzaddik. Is it just Ksamim? Even that's Sarachiyun. Not being very responsive to this idea. You find so that's Hungary, Ukraine. We find Pardes Rimoinim by Ramesh Yitzchak Avigdor, who was a Litvisherov in Kovna and Shklov and other stat. He passed away in 1865. His sefer was printed in 1869. And there in the section called Sifsei Chacham, Sifkat Nalef, he says, look into the Tara. Then he was Mitzayim the Simon Kuf Tzaddik. The word seems like the Sidrei Tara is only relying by Ksam and the Rabbanim, but not with Iya Gemura, B'dikas Eid. And B'chlal the Raya of the Makar, the Matzasi Kosov, whoever that is L'chayra Temua. And B'chlal the Din, Tzmei Hani al Sidrei Tara, She'evi kam B'pshitas Divrei Matzasi Kosov, U'be'emes Hu Das Yechidis. He is a Rav Litter. His impression is, it's a Das Yechidis. We treat red and black. It doesn't matter if it's night to the red or to black. It's all the same thing. So, Galicia, Hungary, Lita, all in the 1860s, and they're all saying, we don't understand the shitta. Certainly, they're not aware, they're not referencing any minig to the contrary. And from their response, it's like they're responding to some kind of novelty. Like someone came and said the most novel idea, and they're trying to figure out how to handle it. We are lacking, though, descriptions of what was actually going on there. Of course, we can't go and quote all the achreinim, but we'll just quote a few more. So, for example, the Shut Beis Shleima that we quoted about, that there's no Messias in Maris in that Shaila, he actually has a direct tshuva on this topic. In Yerdei Bay Simon Dalet is a tshuva from 1865, Chof Hei Shvat. Says there was a woman, she toiveled after she gave birth, she was Meshamash and Baila, and then they found a big reddish stain on her clothing. So they went to this Rav, and the Rav was Matame. They went to someone else, and he was matar. He says, it says in Nida, Isha Mazras Oidem. So it's the Zera Ha'isha. The Zera Ha'isha, after the Tashmish spread on the sheet, and that's where the red came from. You'll be toiling in that. And he says, when I read that, I couldn't believe what I was reading. What? If he was Maida like this, Haida could have been cited to Maida. Mishnah, Gemara, Raya Machmas Tashmish. There could have been title, all the Raya Machmas Tashmish this whole time. That it's the Zera Ha'idem of the Isha. Obviously, what the pshat in that whole musik in the Gemara is a discussion for a different time. But he says, to the extent that the woman has a Zera, it's Lavan. It says Isha Mazeras Oidem, that's Oidem Shabavlad. That's how he tries to explain it. Anyway, of course you can't be toiling in that. What's this guy talking about? The guy had a backup taina. His backup taina was that it wasn't red, it was bright. She says, even if that's true, and we know that the Tara brings the Matzasi Kasov, Ein Makim Lismach al Zeh. Because his whole word is that it's like black, and it's a faint black. Zainoi, the Achshav Timu Chazal, Kolmar Hanoita L'Shachar, Ramban, Ran, B'Sheis of Shach. It has to be love and Lagamre. No, it doesn't have to be love and Lagamre, but it has to be like very, very, very white. But if it's Naitamat, L'Shachar, Ein Lahater B'Shem Oifen, and the Reish Ephraim, he's referencing the Reish Ephraim, who says he doesn't understand the Matzasi Kasov. B'Frat, Shemara Broi Namet, Naitanami K'tzas La'adaim. So you see both Tainas, many mention both Tainas. Sai, I don't understand what matters if it's Shachar. Sai, I don't know what you're talking about, it's Naita La'adaim. So if they relied on that Maida, after who was Matar, after you were Matama, they need a Kapara, Kol Bia, Isser Nidid Rabbanan. And especially in this case where they're craven lemezid, because the Rav told me, he says, no, it doesn't work like that. If the Rav says something so outlandish and so ridiculous, you don't rely on something like that. And that's an important clout to keep in mind, b'chlal and these noisim. You can't just blame it all and put all the achrayas on the Rav. But for that, this Rav had already asked her. So we're seeing a lot in the 1860s in Eastern European countries. They're all saying, we don't know what's up with the Sidjei Tara, with Matzasi Kasov, but it's not lahalacha. On the other hand, we do have an earlier Chashav Makar, the Chachmas Adam, Chashav Litvish Pesach, passed away in 1820. The Chachmas Adam was printed a few years later in 1828. And in Shar Beis Hanoshim, Klal Kuf Yud Aleph, he says, Achshav Kamara Hanoitel Admumas Tameh. Then he adds, Umara Hanoitel Tzeva Broim Lashon Ashkenaz, Shikain Klipas Armoinim, Uchamashke Kave Tahor. V'chol Shekain Bekasem, Shezeh Eine Noitel Admumas. So he writes as a statement in his Seif that it's not Noitel to read. And then he writes in parentheses, Sidjei Tara, B'Shem Matzasi Kasov, but he says it's Noitel L'Shachar, Torah Chiyon, because Kol Mara Shachar Tameh. So this Chachmas Adam actually confused a lot of Achreinim as well. In the Pnim, he writes, Eine Noitel to read, it's Tar. In the parentheses, he says, I don't understand why though. If it's Noitel L'Shachar, then it should be Tameh. So it depends what you want to go with, the Pnim or the parentheses. But if you go with the Pnim, that is an early Chashva Makar in Eastern Europe, someone saying that it's Tar. Pischei Tshuva on the Daf was printed first in 1836, and then he reprinted it again in 1852 with Esophagus. Also just brings up Bistam, Sidjei Tara, Matzasi Kasov, and he adds, V'gam ani Matzasi Zeis Kasov. Matzasi Kasov, I also found the Kasov for who in Shelas Yavetz. Let's jump ahead a little bit to the 1900s. We find the Levushe Mordechai in Hungary, so it's getting recent. This is in 1912. He says, my friend Hagoyin Neiyor Dumatz, doesn't say a name, I don't know if we're supposed to know who it is, wrote to me a list of Achreinim who are all Machmer and Brain. So in the new Levushe Mordechai they actually print, we have the Lashon of that letter. And the person writes that Reish Ephraim, Chachmas Adam, Atzilavayna are all Machmer. The Goyinim after them, the Beis Shleima, the Lechem Simla, the Beis Dovid, another Hungarian Rav. And who would be Mekel Reish Neged Kol HaNigdolim HaMachmirim Befrat Be'Isser Nida? Also the Chura Shoy of Shlomo Yehuda Tabak, printed in 1905, was also maskim, and in fact the Chura Shoy says, even if you hold like the Yaakov Emden and the Sidjei Tara, but maybe they had better eyesight. No, weiter, we'll say the same thing that we say about Chazal. Yaakov Emden and the Sidjei Tara had amazing eyesight, they could figure it out. How are we going to figure out these maros? Well, as we know, for those who are Mekel, it's very complicated. So Rabbi Zoi, we don't have the ability. Weiter. So a lot of Chashuv Rabbanim in Hungary are all saying, Allah Chalamaisa, no go. He says, if this Rav wrote to Levush Mordechai, if it's no red at all, if it's just like coffee with milk, then maybe we could be mekel in a kasam after 3 days for women who this is normal for them. So he's already acknowledging there are some women that keeps on happening. So if it's normal for them and it's that faint, then we can rely on them. But for hafsek tara, we have to be machmir, because the Chachmas Adam says to even be machmir in yellow by a hafsek tara. Even though yellow is achbefedish, the maratar, but for hafsek tara it has to be clean. So even this light brown, that's what that Rav in Hungary wrote. Levush Mordechai responds and says that all these Merkaitis are ignoring the Tvua Shur. The Tvua Shur that the Rosh Ephraim didn't like. But the Tvua Shur, he says, if he got from the Tvua Shur, the way the Tvua Shur looks at brown, is that Einoi loy told us hashachrus, v'loy told us the admimus, kimara b'fnei atzmehu. So we're finally seeing, which Rabbi Emden might have said, but this is being said clearly, that perhaps it's simply its own color. Then you solve all the problems. It's not noted to this, not noted to that. We're only machmer what's noted to admimus, and this is not, so it's not a problem. Like I said, some say that maybe what Rabbi Emden himself is saying. So it sounds like Levush Mordechai is leaning towards saying we could find a basis to be matar. And he adds, by the way, you counted the Chachmas Adam among the Machmirim? I think it's the opposite. Look, the Pnim says it's tar. The parentheses. He's just asking on the Siddur Tara and the Yaakov Emden saying that it's a black. How does black help anything? But surely he holds like me that it's its own color. It's a matter of atzmai. So that's why he wrote what he wrote in the Pnim. Why would he leave Makim Latos B'dvarav if he didn't hold that it was tar? He wrote tar in the Pnim. Okay. So it sounds like Levush Mordechai is finally getting on board. However, if it's like chestnuts or like black coffee, after all that, still lahachmir, this is 1912 in Hungary. But coffee as it comes from the store, from the coffee shop, it has milk, it's a lighter coffee, then pshita she'makam lahachmir she'im bezel le'shachris le'admum is klal. So okay, we already see someone saying depends what shade of brown. Dark tshuva, which is a combination, anida, which is a combination of the munkacher's father and the munkacher himself. Whatever is in brackets is from the munkacher himself. So they come to sum up the shaklevataya. So the dark tshuva's father, the father of the munkacher, he writes ayin pischit tshuva from the Siddur Tara, v'ayin besimla, v'ayin besif sechachim, the pardes ridmayim. So those are two makaidas that say no. And then in brackets the munkacher adds ayin chachmas adam, ayin simlas binyamin. Ayin Kanem Shleima Has in Hungary, was also massacred on the Siddur Tara. See the base Dovid, who's massacred on the Siddur Tara. See the base Ephraim and Terefah. See the base Shleima. He's just rattling off all these Achreinim that all say that it's no good. And then he mentions that if the woman can't be matar, the Imra Yesher says that then maybe we can be Seimech on the Siddur Tara, but still not Hafsek Tara and Zayin Akiyim. Even he is still Machmer on that. Brings the Chura Shoy. The Chura Shoy said, you can't, sometimes you want to say, if the tefillah is going to fall on a Friday night, as a result, if you treat the brown as a Mara, you're going to cause her to be tevel on Friday night. If you're Matar, she can not go earlier than Friday night. Don't you want to be makel in order to save her from teveling on Friday night, which causes problems with the chafifa? There's no. It comes to other things, stam kulas and the veltanai, the 4 days, the 5 days, that's stam akula. But when it comes to brain, this is mara. You can't be just makel stam for the joy of it. However, there were, of course, I'm just bringing all of these to give you a sense of how literally up until the Dark Tshuva was printed in 1921. In 1921, the Munkacher, you open a Dark Tshuva and you still get the sense that overwhelmingly everyone says Mara Broin is Tameh. Are there other Makaitis from those years that say Tar? Yeah. So, for example, there's a Sefer Be'er Mayim Chaim Al Bushe Tara from 1862 that says, go with the Siddur Tara. There's a Sefer Taras Yisrael from 1910 that says Yesh Lahakol. There's a later tradition that says it claims that the Divrei Yecheskel of Shinava, the Divrei Chaim's son, was Mekel. The Aruch HaShulchan right here says Pshita she'en lanu lahachmer b'chinam, he verteiches Rebbe Emden's word to make it make sense. So in conclusion, from all of this information, the etzem idea that the paskening that brown is a tahor, even if that's spread, mamish, you could say in the last 100 years or less, nothing wrong with that. Like any halacha, certain psakim become popular and spread, that's darka shel Torah. But what we do see clearly is that aside from these discussions in Torah, aside from those Makaitis we started with last time, I'd say clearly there's no Messiah, but if you just look at all the Shakla V'Tarya here about Brian, it's clear there's no Messiah. And everyone is just saying Svaras, each one's thinking like it's a new question. Now, it's very possible that there was some Rav somewhere that was already being Mekel for a while and was Makabel from his Rav to be Mekel, and maybe that goes back to the year 1800, Barach. It has to be from after the Sidrei Torah. Could it go back somewhere till the year 1800? It's possible, but we don't know that for a fact either. And anyway, there's nothing special about the fact that, let's say, a certain Rav was Makabel from his Rebbe to be Mekel or be Machmir. We don't call that a Messiah, so that doesn't make it special. And we know that even as late as after the Holocaust, there still were many Rabbanim who were still Machmir in this, were very Machmir in this Tchum. And apparently, even till today, you can still find. And it's not that they didn't know about the Messiah. One isn't more of a Messiah than the other one. They're both completely equal. It just happens to be that in the last few decades, most Meirei Hira were tempted to follow the Shitta, that's Mekel. Which means, because not once you're Makabel, the Psak, which itself is a very late Psak, to be Mekel B'chlal, then as we say, all the problems open up. Because now, instead of being simple, it becomes extremely complicated again. Which, as we said, seems to itself run a little contrary to how this halacha is supposed to work. Because only brown, like coffee, without red, is tar. If it is neitilat mumis, still befedish and shulchan aruch, that everyone agrees it's tameh. And everyone agrees that blood itself could be somewhat brown. Are we going to tar all the blood in the world because it's somewhat brown? No. So you have to learn, start identifying what is purely brown like coffee and what has a tinge of red. And that's where the main Messiah comes into the picture, which as best as we can tell is maximum from the last 100 years or so. It could be more, no way of saying, no way of telling. Just to tell you a little bit of where the Messiah comes from, in Eretz Yisrael there was a Rav from Ukraine, he's known as the Teplika Rav. His name is Rav Shimshon Aaron Polonsky. He went to Eretz Yisrael in 1922, he passed away in 1948, and all Dafka the Eida Charedis, Dafka, all of those with the kaftans, and they all learned from him already in that dar, and from them there's hundreds, if not thousands of Talmidim, which have influenced even the Yeshiva Shavelt, and he apparently was Mekel in brown itself, he was Mekel in reddish brown to a very extreme degree, and he seems to be the makar of the most lenient Messiahs. And if Chatzkel Roth, who was famous here in America as being very lenient, he spent many years in Eretz Yisrael in his youth, and I would assume it should be obvious that he must be the American representative of that Shita here. In America, of course, we have the Debret Sinner, and the Piskei Beir Moshe, they write that he was Mekabel from his Shver, it was a step Shver, Shlomo Tzvi Strasser of Debret Sin, and that's where it ends, it doesn't go past that. And even he's not Mekel as much, it's just about Taka being able to distinguish between brown and red, but at least you're learning how to be Mekel in brown. The Yitzchak Avriel is Magda, he says, my Rabbi, the Papa Rav, he was Makabel from a different guy, a Talmud of the Rugas HaBoisim from Hungary, and he was Machmir in Brian. V'chen yadaiti sh'Rabbani Poland v'Russia v'Galicia machmirim b'zeh u'be'Ungarin makilim. That the kula originates, it's clearly not that straightforward, because so many Hungarian Rabbanim were machmir, and the Teplika was from Ukraine, but that's what the Welt says. The kulas come from Hungary. And Rav Moshe was still machmir in Brian, etc., etc. Even in Chabad, we know that many of the old Meirei Hira from back in the Haim didn't have any such Messiah at all. And most Meirei Hira and Chabad Pashut went and learned by the same popular Rabbanim that everyone goes to. And the next year, we didn't have a chance, there's just a small footnote we'll have to get to next time about whether there's any mashmos in the Tzemach Tzedek about Brain. There are a few mashmos in here and there, but mainly I would like to continue in the next installment. We'll talk about the argument that people want to make that actually from the Mishnah and from Chazal it's very clear that brown was in fact included in the shades of red in the Mishnah all along. And we'll also get to the controversy that broke out in the last 10-15 years, fighting against the Messiah of the Teplik Arav and arguing that's essentially being Matahir Dam Nida B'Shufi.